Welcome back to Sunrise City. Well, we now have to head to Abuja, and Makwe is taking this next one. Makwe.
Oh, yes, we have with us Mr. Alex Akoh, who is the Director General of the Bureau for Public Enterprises. You're welcome to Sunrise Daily.
Thank you very much.
Well, I don't know if the workers, you know, the nation's workers like to hear about the Bureau for Public Enterprises. They always look at it as the enterprise that seems to take government assets away from the people and put it in private hands. That's how it is viewed in our country. Why do you think that is so?
Well, thank you very much for having me. I think that that's an unfortunate perception of the process of privatization itself, because the notion of privatization suggests that you know, public enterprises, state-owned enterprises, are better managed, you know, given the principles that guide, you know, private sector businesses. So the process of actually divesting government interest in those enterprises, especially from our experience in the past 30 years, seems to suggest that those enterprises are given, are handed over to certain powerful interest in the country.
So that's a perception you've also had to confront as well?
Certainly, certainly. And it really doesn't help the process, but it's really not what privatization is all about.
Is that perception, do you think it has its basis in facts?
Well, I really don't think so. I really don't think so. If you look at the fact that the initial wave of privatization that was done, especially as it relates to the banking industry, actually used a transaction methodology of initial public offers, which means that the shares for these banks that were previously owned by the government were offered to the public, you know, via the stock market. So for us, I think that that's a process of democratizing the divestment policy of government from those state-owned enterprises, and then it gives the opportunity for inclusion, you know, so that people can participate in the ownership of federal assets that are being privatized. But I must add that some of the transactions that have been done have given the impression, you know, that you know, certain powerful interests have, you know, really taken hold of national assets. Yeah.
Well, some people draw the distinction between privatization and deregulation. And they talk about how when government deregulates, they open up the market for private sector to be able to participate.
Absolutely.
And then there's the area where when they privatize their own assets. When they look at the privatization of government assets over the years, they say it hasn't quite worked out in terms of, you know, when government finally hands over these assets, because of giving the assets to those who are not able to properly manage. Our experience with privatization has not been very successful. Is that an assessment you will agree with?
Not totally, but it's an excellent point that you made, you know, about the difference between deregulation and privatization. I'll give you a perfect example. Now, the telecommunications industry was deregulated, you know, in the early 2000s to allow for private sector participation in that industry or in that sector. Now, the government was not particularly divesting, you know, its ownership of its main telecoms operation then. It just opened up the space through deregulation for private sector telecoms operators to come in. So that's an example of deregulation. Now, privatization actually involves the actual divestment of government shares from previously state-owned enterprises, and that process, you know, previously has been managed in such a way that it makes those enterprises available for the generality of Nigerians to participate in. Now, if we go through, you know, the process of core investor sale, for example, of those assets, then the outcome of that will tend to lead to, you know, having a core investor, private investor group, then take control of those assets. So I think that's in such cases, the impression, you know, has been created that, you know, federal government assets are being handed over to private individuals.
Transparency is always a major issue. And, you know, last time we were told, I think the last time we had the privatization issue that was Well, come see, come star. Some people will say it was transparent. Some other people will say, well, with our experience now, can you really say this was transparent?
Yes.
Looking at the power sector,
absolutely, yes.
you know, there are huge questions as to, did we give it to competent hands? Did we give it to people who had the experience? But then there's also the argument that we hear that we wanted to also give it to Nigerians. We wanted Nigerians to own it, and we didn't want foreign partners. But given what we've seen on the ground and given our experience of that privatization process, do you think it could have been done better?
Well, hindsight is always what do you call it? It's 20/20 vision. Certainly, there were gaps in the way that the power sector privatization program was handled. But I think that what is important to note really is that this transaction, the privatization of the power sector in Nigeria, is perhaps the biggest privatization exercise in the whole of the African continent. Now, it is conceivable then that, you know, there will be gaps in that process. Yes, perhaps, you know, we could have structured the process in such a way that it will attract more credible and, you know, tested operators of that sector, whether it's on the generation side or the distribution side. But, you know, I think that, you know, it's something that we do not have to completely dwell on permanently. The Power Sector Recovery Program has provided us, you know, an opportunity to reset the entire process and then begin to refine it so that the initial intention of privatizing the power sector is ultimately achieved. Now, if you look at, you know, the statistics pre-privatization 2013, what was the total generation capacity, you know, of the country then? You know, maybe about 2,700 megawatts. That has improved tremendously over the past 4 years. The distribution infrastructure was practically collapsing because PHCN or government just didn't have the resources, you know, to invest in those infrastructure. Now, there has been considerable improvement, not as we would have loved to see in, you know, in the provision or in the investment in that infrastructure, but certainly not where we were in 2013, you know, pre-privatization. So yes, there are lessons to be learned, you know, from the way it was handled, but I think that, you know, it was the right thing to do.